Welcome to the deep dive. If you're a new listener, well, here's how this works. We basically take a stack of sources, articles, research papers, our own frantic midnight notes, and we try to extract the most vital nuggets of insight, to give you a shortcut to being well-informed. And we custom tailor each deep dive for you, the listener, to make sure it hits that exact intersection of fascinating and practical.
Yeah, it is really all about separating the signal from the noise. I mean, we want to give you those aha moments that completely change how you view the world around you without burying you in information overload.
Right, and today's topic is, honestly, it's going to change how you look at progress itself. Just think about a time you tried to push a brilliant, obviously superior new idea in your field.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Right, you brought the data, you made the pitch, and, well, nothing. The idea just ends up sitting in a waiting room somewhere. Not because it's flawed, but because the old guard simply refuses to budge. You are stuck there, holding a magazine, essentially waiting for someone to clear out so progress can finally happen.
It is a totally maddening experience. I mean, you look at a system, you see the friction, and you wonder why human beings are just so resistant to better methods. But the sources we are looking at today suggest that this waiting room experience isn't a glitch in how human knowledge advances. It is actually a deeply embedded structural feature.
Exactly, and that is our mission today. We are diving into a brilliant essay by Elias Kunis titled, Why Science Advances Funeral by Funeral.
Great title.
It really is. And the title is a nod to a legendary observation made by the physicist Max Planck. Back in 1949, Planck was looking back at the brutal struggle to get the physics community to accept quantum mechanics. He wrote, rather resignedly, that a new scientific truth doesn't usually win by convincing its opponents and making them see the light.
Right, they don't just suddenly agree?
Nope. It wins because those opponents eventually die,
Yeah.
and a new generation grows up familiar with the concept.
Yeah, and later on, the economist Paul Samuelson compressed Planck's observation into a much catchier slogan, which is, science advances one funeral at a time.
Which is pretty grim, but yeah.
It is, but it's a quote that gets thrown around constantly in academia and tech circles, mostly because it just keeps surviving contact with reality. I mean, generational replacement is observable. Paradigms really do stall out until senior figures physically depart from the stage.
But, we aren't here just to complain about stubborn seniors. We want to figure out the why and the how. How does a single human lifespan act as a physical bottleneck for an entire field of human knowledge? So grab a coffee or take a longer route on your walk, because we are unpacking the hidden architecture of how knowledge actually moves.
Yeah, to get to the bottom of this, we first have to discard the standard explanation, which is the one almost everyone intuitively jumps to.
The psychological one.
Right. The conventional reading of Planck's quote is purely psychological. The narrative is that an older scientist spends like 40 years of their life building a specific theoretical framework. Their entire identity is wrapped up in it.
It's their baby.
Exactly. So when a new paradigm threatens to demolish their life's work, their ego kicks in, and they just stubbornly dig their heels in.
The classic stubborn old genius trope. The prevailing wisdom says the entire roadblock is just a cognitive bias sitting inside one person's skull. But okay, let's unpack this, because if this is purely about the ego and stubbornness of aging brains, why is that stubbornness so incredibly selective?
Selective is the key word there.
Yeah, because senior scientists are perfectly happy to update their beliefs on a million other things. They eagerly adopt new lab equipment, they integrate minor discoveries, they shift their focus to new sub-areas. I mean, they aren't walking around rejecting reality across the board.
That selective rigidity is really the first major clue that psychology isn't the main culprit here.
Think about it like a homeowner. You have someone who has lived in a house for 40 years. They are thrilled to remodel the kitchen. They will upgrade the plumbing. They might even knock down a non-load-bearing wall to open up the living room. They love modernizing.
Right, sure.
But the moment a structural engineer tells them the foundation is actively sinking and the entire house needs to be jacked up and rebuilt from the dirt, suddenly they get incredibly stubborn. They will insist the floors are supposed to slant. The resistance isn't an aversion to change, it's an aversion to collapse.
That homeowner analogy points us directly toward the structural reality Kunis highlights in his essay. If you have a stubborn homeowner who lives in a cabin out in the woods, well, their denial only affects them.
Right.
In science, if you have a cranky, stubborn researcher sitting on the extreme periphery of a field, their psychological block changes nothing. They are just a curmudgeon writing angry letters.
Just shouting into the void.
Exactly. But if that stubborn individual is sitting at the absolute center of the discipline, they have the power to freeze the intellectual progress of thousands of people. We have to stop looking at this as a psychological quirk and start analyzing it as a structural barrier.
So if we take ego and mindset off the table as the primary drivers, what actually gives one senior scientist the raw, unadulterated power to stop an entire scientific field in its tracks?
Well, to answer that, the essay introduces us to a fascinating framework called trapped equilibria, and
Yep.
specifically a concept known as concentric capture.
Concentric capture.
Yeah. The central idea here is that the senior figure isn't just an influential voice, they actually function as a load-bearing node.
Like the central pillar holding up a massive suspension bridge. If it doesn't move, nothing connected to it moves either.
Exactly that. And this node doesn't just control one aspect of the field. A discipline becomes captured when a single figure, or, a very tight cluster of figures, simultaneously controls 4 intertwined axes of power. Let's walk through them, because understanding how these interlock is really the key to the whole mystery.
Let's do it.
So the first axis is epistemic authority. This is the power to define reality. They decide what counts as a serious, legitimate research question, what a rigorous method looks like, and what constitutes a valid result.
They basically write the rule book for the game. If you aren't playing by their rules, you aren't even considered to be playing the game.
Yes, exactly. The second axis is status weight. This is the prestige economy. If this central figure cites your paper, or invites you to co-author a study, or publicly praises your intellect, well, your career is essentially made. You are anointed.
And conversely, if they treat you like a ghost, the rest of the community treats you like a ghost too. It's like the ultimate cool kids table.
It really is. Now, the third axis moves from the social to the physical, which is material position. This is where the rubble meets the road.
Funding, I assume.
Oh, massive funding. They control the massive laboratories. They sit on the boards that distribute the multi-million-dollar grants. They place their former students in all the highly coveted tenure-track jobs. They dictate what work actually gets the financial calories it needs to survive.
Okay, so they have the rule book, they have the social clout, and they hold the checkbook. What is the fourth?
The fourth is their coordination role. This is how they signal to the rest of the community. It is their visible reaction at major conferences, their editorial tone in the leading journals, or even just like the knowing chuckles they give behind closed doors when a specific theory is mentioned.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this coordination axis broadcasts to everyone else in the field exactly how expensive it will be to challenge the dominant paradigm.
But wait, I'm trying to picture this in practice. Isn't this just a very academic way of saying this person is incredibly famous? I mean, we have celebrities in every industry. Why is this uniquely paralyzing in science?
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of how these 4 elements interact. Being famous just means people know who you are. Being a load-bearing node means these 4 axes are deeply structurally bonded together. Kunis calls this cliff edge coupling.
Cliff edge coupling, meaning if you slip off the edge of one axis, you take a catastrophic fall down the rest of them.
Precisely. Let's look at how this plays out for a young, brilliant researcher. Imagine you are 28 years old, and you look at the dominant paradigm and realize the math just doesn't add up. You disagree intellectually, which is a challenge on that first axis, the epistemic axis.
Right.
In a healthy, decoupled field, you would publish your critique, you'd have a vigorous debate, and you might lose the argument, but life goes on.
But in a captured field where these axes are glued together, what happens?
The bonding triggers a total collapse. Because you challenge the epistemic rules, your work isn't just labeled incorrect. The central node coordinates a signal that your work is unserious.
Wow.
And because you are deemed unserious, your status weight drops to 0. Because your status is gone, you are suddenly unfundable on the material axis. You won't get the grant, you won't get the lab space, and you will be quietly filtered out of the hiring pool. Disagreeing on a purely intellectual level triggers a total career loss.
It is like living in a company town. The mining company doesn't just employ you. They own the grocery store, they own the bank, and they own the mayor. If you file a grievance about unsafe conditions in the mine, they don't just debate the safety protocols with you. They evict you from your house and refuse to sell you food.
That is an incredibly sharp way to visualize it. And when you realize the sheer scale of the penalty, you understand why the waiting room exists. It becomes wildly unsafe to build a career around a new idea. So the field freezes.
Which brings us to the most dramatic part of Planck's observation. If the entire ecosystem is structurally locked to this one person's pulse, their sudden absence wouldn't just be a shift in tone, it would be a massive earthquake. But why does it have to be a funeral? Why doesn't retirement trigger the same scientific advancement?
It really comes down to the simultaneity of the release. When a massive figure retires, it is a slow fade. They might loosen their grip on the material axis, they close their physical lab, they step down from the day-to-day grant committees, they might stop attending every conference, weakening their coordination role.
Right, they go play golf or write a memoir.
Yes, but they retain their epistemic legacy. As an emeritus professor, their status weight is still incredibly heavy. The structural bracing of the field is only partially dismantled. Junior researchers might start probing at the edges of the dominant theory, but the core foundation remains highly protected.
So they still cast a shadow.
Exactly. Death, on the other hand, is instantaneous and total. It violently removes the person from all four axes at once. They are irreversibly gone.
They can't sit in the front row of a lecture hall and scowl at a young postdoc presenting a heretical method.
And their status weight cannot be invoked to swing tomorrow's hiring committee. The threat of their coordination signal vanishes overnight. And, you don't just have to take the theory's word for it. There's brilliant empirical proof of this exact mechanism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In 2019, the American Economic Review published a landmark study by Pierre Azoulay, Christian Fons Rosen, and Joshua Graf Zivin. It is perhaps the most pristine empirical specimen we have for this phenomenon.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the way they measure this is wild. What did the study actually track?
They tracked the premature, unexpected deaths of 452 eminent life scientists.
Wow.
Yeah, these were massive load-bearing nodes who died suddenly, meaning the field didn't have time to prepare or slowly adjust. The researchers then mapped the output of the subfields those stars had dominated.
And what happened when the keystone was suddenly yanked out of the arch?
Well, two things. First, the publication output of the deceased stars' direct collaborators, so the people operating inside their paradigm, actually fell.
Makes sense.
But the second finding is the crucial one. The output of completely non-collaborating outsiders spiked dramatically. Peripheral researchers just flooded into the discipline.
Oh.
And they didn't just publish more papers, they pulled from entirely different schools of thought. They cited different foundational literature, they brought in novel methods, and their papers went on to be disproportionately highly cited by the wider scientific community.
The wall came down and the innovators rushed in. But, the detail from that study that absolutely blew my mind, and Kunis highlights this in the essay, is that when the researchers dug into the data, they didn't find a cabal of evil villains.
This is vital. The dead stars weren't acting as malicious gatekeepers.
Right. They weren't sitting in smoky rooms systematically tossing rival grant applications into a fire. They weren't actively suppressing people.
They didn't need to do anything active at all. The essay explains that their mere existence set the invisible entry costs for the field.
Let's translate that. What does setting an entry cost actually look like in day-to-day life before they die?
It looks like intense, invisible self-censorship. When a field is captured, a junior researcher knows exactly what the dominant figure thinks. So when they sit down to write a grant proposal, they ask themselves, will this get past the review board? They know the board will reflect the preferences of the central node. So they quietly sand down the edges of their own proposal, they delete the controversial hypothesis, they conform to the accepted method before they ever even hit submit.
Wow.
Yeah, the boundary policing is self-inflicted by the community because the cost of challenging the node is career suicide.
It's the chilling effect. Nobody has to reject your paper if you are too terrified to even write it. But the second the funeral happens, that invisible cost of admission evaporates. The peripheral researchers who had been privately harboring doubts suddenly feel safe enough to speak up. The field's geometry completely resets, but nobody actually changed their minds.
Exactly.
It wasn't about convincing the old guard. It was about the old guard no longer casting a shadow over the funding and the jobs.
That is the profound takeaway. The cascade of innovation after a funeral is driven by a change in the field's structural constraints, not a change in individual human psychology.
So, if death opens this massive aperture for progress, does Planck's rule apply universally? Like, is literally every branch of human knowledge just waiting for a funeral to experience a breakthrough?
Not at all. The essay is very precise about the conditions where this pattern holds, and importantly, where it completely fails. The most obvious scenario where a funeral does not lead to advancement is a state of incomplete succession.
Meaning, the load-bearing node figured out how to clone their influence before they died.
Essentially, yes. If the senior scientist was incredibly effective at distributing their paradigm, if they placed intensely loyal students in all the key department chairs, if they stacked the editorial boards of the major journals, and if they rewrote the core textbooks, then their physical death changes very little.
I see.
Their loyal successors simply inherit control of the four axes and immediately rebond them around the exact same theories.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The funeral in that case isn't a rupture. It is just a royal coronation for the next generation of the old guard.
Exactly. For Planck's pattern to trigger a revolution, the deceased figure had to be carrying so much personal, unique weight that the remaining network simply lacks the gravity to keep the four axes bonded without them.
So what does this all mean for the listener who isn't in academia? Does this apply differently depending on the speed of an industry? I'm thinking about the difference between highly theoretical fields in something like software engineering, where things seem to move at light speed.
This raises a really important question about the speed of empirical feedback. How fast does reality check your work? The pattern of needing funerals holds absolute dominance in fields where feedback from reality is agonizingly slow. Think about theoretical physics.
Right.
Kunis points to the hegemony of string theory over the last few decades, drawing heavily on observations by the physicist Lee Smolin.
Yeah, in string theory, you are dealing with math that describes the universe at a scale we currently cannot observe. You can't just build a machine over the weekend to definitively prove the theory right or wrong.
Right. It can take decades to get from a mathematical theory to an actual physical confirmation. Because reality is so slow to answer, the field has no choice but to rely on proxy metrics. They rely on expert evaluation, concentrated hiring signals, and the prestige of the dominant cluster.
The social stuff.
Exactly. The load-bearing node has decades to firmly capture the axis of power because the universe isn't interrupting them with hard data.
But if we contrast that with software engineering, or even clean bench biology,
the dynamic completely flips. In software, you don't need a committee to tell you if a new approach works. You write the code, and it either compiles and runs efficiently, or it crashes. The feedback from reality is almost instantaneous.
it doesn't matter if the person pushing the old method is the most famous developer in Silicon Valley. If their app crashes and a 22-year-old's app runs flawlessly, the market adopts the new method by Tuesday. You don't need the famous developer to die.
Exactly. Fast external feedback reprices the value of methods on a timescale far shorter than human careers. When reality answers faster than human lifespans, power cannot centralize tightly enough to require a funeral. The binding constraint in fast fields is the experiment or the market, not the judgment of a senior figure.
That is such a clarifying distinction. The slower reality speaks, the more a field relies on the loud voices of its elders. But for those slow fields, the deep sciences, the long-term public policies, the massive institutional architectures, we can't just sit around praying for funerals.
No, absolutely not.
So how do we intentionally fix a broken, captured system while the senior figures are still healthy and breathing?
Well, a discipline that relies on funerals is fundamentally sick. It lacks what Kunis calls a live decoupling mechanism. Relying on funerals treats human progress as a morbid accident. It means that between these rare generational turnovers, vital dissent is accumulating silently, brilliant careers are actively routing away from the biggest questions, and decades of potential innovation are completely suppressed.
It's an incalculable waste of human potential. So the solution has to be structural. We have to find a way to unglue those four axes: epistemic, status, material, and coordination, while everyone is still alive.
And importantly, you cannot just politely ask the load-bearing node to be more open-minded.
Right.
Because of the structural bonding, they genuinely cannot see the chilling effect they have on the field. From their perspective, the field agrees with them because they are right. The repair requires intentionally building alternative pathways, new funding lines, independent editorial venues, alternative career tracks that are entirely outside the gravitational pull of the dominant cluster.
But play devil's advocate with me here.
Right.
We already have this. We have preprint servers online where anyone can upload a research paper for free. We have independent crowdfunded science platforms. We have post-publication peer review on the internet. Hasn't technology already decoupled the system?
It's a fair point, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, having nominal technological alternatives is not the same thing as having a functional decoupling mechanism. This is the brutal reality of the prestige economy. A preprint server doesn't decouple a field if university hiring committees still view anything published outside the traditional node-controlled journals as an amateur effort.
Ah, You can publish your brilliant heretical paper for the whole world to read, but if it doesn't have the blessing of the old guard, you still aren't getting a paycheck.
That's the trap. Alternative funding bodies are useless if the principal investigators who receive that money can't get their postdocs hired into tenure-track positions later. A decoupling mechanism only works if it successfully generates tangible career value.
It has to pay the rent.
Exactly. It must offer enough status, material support, and coordination return for a dissenter to literally survive, feed their family, and build a respected career before the dominant figure passes away.
And I'm guessing the people currently sitting at the center of the dominant cluster do not appreciate these alternative pathways being built.
Oh, they fight them fiercely. This brings us to the active policing layer of any captured field. The prize committee members, the peer review enforcers, the orthodox commentators. They have a massive vested interest in making sure those four axes stay glued together. Kunis notes that this bonding gives them a rent on the boundary.
Let's break that down. A rent on the boundary means they're essentially operating a toll booth on the bridge to career success. If you build a second bridge, an alternative pathway that bypasses their toll booth, their power to police the boundary becomes completely worthless.
Exactly. Their prestige relies entirely on the bottleneck existing. So naturally, they will attack any decoupling mechanism as lowering standards or promoting junk science. Building a truly healthy scientific institution requires brave actors who are willing to absorb those attacks, ignore the toll booth operators, and build the alternative career pathways anyway.
So to pull all of these threads together, when Max Planck said science advances one funeral at a time, he wasn't making a cynical joke about human stubbornness. He was describing the physics of power in a closed system. He was describing what happens when the ability to define truth, the distribution of status, the control of money, and the power of public coordination are all concentrated into a single human bottleneck.
Beautifully summarized.
A truly healthy ecosystem, whether that is a global scientific discipline or a multinational corporation, actively works to separate being right from simply outliving the people who disagree with you. It builds parallel paths to success so that progress doesn't require a hearse.
And that leads me to a final thought for you to take away from this dive. We've spent this entire time talking about the lifespan of human beings acting as the bottleneck. But look at the trajectory of our own era. What happens to the advancement of knowledge when the load-bearing node is no longer a mortal human?
Wait, what do you mean?
Think about the rise of algorithmic gatekeepers, automated grant review systems, or massive AI models that are increasingly being used to evaluate the quality or relevance of new ideas, content, and research.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. These systems control the epistemic rules, they coordinate visibility, and they dictate material success. But unlike the senior scientists holding back the quantum revolution, an algorithm never retires, and an AI model never has a funeral. If we don't actively build live decoupling mechanisms into our digital infrastructure right now, we risk creating a captured field where the waiting room never ever clears out.
Now that is a terrifying and fascinating thought to end on. If progress requires a funeral, make sure the thing blocking the door is moral. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive, and we will catch you next time.